We come to the 18th presentation in this year-long excursion into what is entitled Parayana. And the title Parayana comes from a collection of remembered sayings of the Buddha that were woven together. There were 16 of them, and they became the core with resonant other verses. They became known as the Parayana. In the Buddha's time, the word para meant not what we understand today as beyond, like paradise, the old Persian, is beyond this worldly order, or paranormal, beyond the normal. Para in Sanskrit had the sense of across a space that is not a part of the form, either where you have gone from and where you have arrived. So that the sense of a Parayana, yana is way. The Mahayana is the great way. The Vajrayana is the diamond, jewel way. The Parayana was the way across a gulf that where we are in this world has in fact a shore. It has what we would call a boundary. And that the boundedness of the world extends itself so that when you're a toddler, you have gone beyond the world of the crib and of crawling. And when you're able to be more mature, you keep extending the boundaries. And so what is characteristic all the way through as a theme is boundedness gives us the world in which we live, in which we have our concourse and discourse and intercourse and so forth. The Parayana is going across from the boundedness as a shore, no matter how extensive that boundary is, it can be visioned as a shore. And to leave that shore and go across is indeed super perilous because it is supernatural. It has a quality of going over a gap that is unfathomable, that has no boundedness, is in fact the visionary field of infinity. When an Englishman who fought in the Second World War got fed up with all of the carnage and war, he was in North India, and he eventually discovered the Sutras of the Buddha. The written down form, sutra means thread. It means the written sayings of the Buddha, this written way in which the oral teachings of the Buddha were of the world of that time, but the sutras carry it beyond the shores of the world of that time to further boundedness, or can carry it to the other shore, which is always an impossible possibility. when one is working not just with truths of the world, dharma, but one is able to do an adventurous excursion, Parayana, across into the other shore. Now one has a high dharma. One recognizes if there's another shore, then all shores, including this new one, need to be taken with a great breath. The original Upanishad, called the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. Brihad in Sanskrit means great breath. The Aranyaka in Sanskrit means forest teaching. And the great breath forest teaching begins its Parayana by saying, that sun up there is the eye of a horse. The wind blowing the clouds is the mane of that horse. And so the entire sky of our world is a horse by which we can ride beyond, further. And that's how the Upanishads began, like that. The author of this little collection of books, Crossing the Stream, another word for the boundary is that this is a stream. That boundary is not etched in stone. It's not drawn on the land. It's not even circumscribed in the mind, but it's a stream. The way in which stream in this way comes into the Western usage, this is the Buddhist usage, but the Western usage is from William James, where he used the term stream of consciousness. That consciousness, as a stream, has the ability to take us out of the boundaries of time, out of the measurements of time. And one of his close friends, Henri Bergson, the great French philosopher around the turn of the 20th century, as William James was as well, used the term durée, meaning that there is a creative time which is a flow and is like a stream of consciousness. And William James took up the phrase in English, stream of consciousness, crossing the stream. And bhikshu is someone who has learned to live by this. His name in Sanskrit, Sangha Rakshita, means the one who is able to really understand by being able to live it in a new key, and that new key is one that one has crossed the threshold of the previous compositional limitations, and now one has come through the doorway. He writes about pauses and empty spaces, and just a paragraph or so. When the composer Mozart was asked what was the most important part of his music, he did not reply that melody or harmony or counterpoint or even orchestration was the most important, but simply the pauses. As in the music of Mozart, so in the paintings of the Far Eastern, China and Japan, masters of landscape art, it is the empty spaces which are the most important parts of the picture. The vast empty space of sky or snow or water are not only themselves charged with mysterious significance, as a cloud with lightning, but they somehow infuse that significance into the single blossomless branch or the tiny floating boat or solitary human figure which stands almost lost at the edge or in the center of the huge blank expanse of paper or faintly tainted silk. the most important empty spaces are those that we encounter as we are encountering here. In the way across, the way beyond, although beyond now is overused in this particular time period. Our first 17 presentations in Parayana were subentitled Entering Our High Dharma Way. With the 18th, we now modify this, change this, to Coursing in the Great Way, because we are now taking a cue from the earliest of the refinements of classical Buddhism from the Dharma into the really high Dharma, the Mahayana, the Great Way. And the key to it, the doorway which will be open to it, is the way in which there is a weaving of great traditions of civilization that came together for the first time as a fabric that would take the impress of all of the images, of all of the myths, of all of the symbols, and bring them forth into a larger openness, the farther shore of which was something that was described in a book called the Pistis Sophia. And we will get to that in a couple of presentations. Pistis in Greek is faith, and Sophia is wisdom. The faith is masculine, the wisdom is feminine. The book of faith wisdom, and the first of the Mahayana books to be written by Asvaghosha about 90 AD, about the time that the Hermetica were being begun in Alexandria, about the time that the Council of Jamnia was beginning rabbinic Judaism, about the time that St. John had been taken to Rome by Domitian and tried to be killed and could not, and so was exiled to the island of Patmos off the coast, there to be left to rot and there to write the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse. All of these things happening at the same time in far west, what was then beginning to be a Britain. The cup of the Last Supper fell out of the mitochondria heritage of the DNA of the Buddhist family going back 2,000 years. Fell out, and the last survivors, the elder brother, took that cup back to where it should have been. And at that time, it was very difficult because the whole tradition in its viability rested on St. John. He was the last living person who was of the Buddhist family in a masculine way, who was directly capable. And so being in exile on Patmos, he was unable to receive. The man's name was Bran, or Bran. And Bran is always called the Blessed. Bran the Blessed, because he was able to bring that cup back to where it was supposed to be, to whom it really now would belong, because St. John was a spirit son of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. had been adopted as the last act on the cross and crucifixion, and became the first act in the resurrection of identifying and emerging to Mary Magdalene, who became the spirit mother of St. John. All of these things happening about 90 AD. All of these aspects occurring. And what we're taking a look at is how the threads of what needs to still be written and read and understood are so disparate now and almost unknown that it has been impossible for anyone to have a realization that is real. For instance, have you ever heard of Sandari Nanda? Sandari Nanda, this is from an introduction, there's a short introduction of all of the poems, the prayer poems, the psalms of the female followers of the Buddha, collected together from the disparate Pali texts and put together as a collection and translated into English in 1909. And the woman who did this, her name was Caroline, and she had a beautiful couple of middle names, Augusta Foley. And she married Thomas, or T.W. Rhys Davids. And Rhys Davids was an intellectual Welsh savant who was studying Buddhism. And so his wife, they met, and within weeks they were married. And both of them did monumental translations from the 1890s into the 1920s. Caroline lived to 1942. She was born in 1857. She writes about Sandari Nanda. She verily was born in the time of Padumuttara Buddha, and this is an ancient Buddha before our historical Buddha, and she then was reborn in the time of our historical Buddha 2,500 years ago, and she was the half-sister of the Buddha. Did you know that he had a half-sister? That she was the most beautiful woman of her time? She was the great beauty of her time? And when the son of the Buddha, Rahula, joined the Buddha, his community, and all of the other relatives joined, even the mother of Sandari Nanda, Prajapati, was joining. It wasn't until Sandara Nanda realized, looking into a mirror as she so often did so long, that she was aging. And she went to her half-brother, who received her. Behold, Nanda, the foul compound, diseased, impure, compel thy heart to contemplate what is not fair to view. So steel thyself and concentrate the well-composed mind. And she, replying, and this is the hymn of the Theravada, even I have seen inside and out this body as in truth it really is. Who ought to know the what and why of it, with zeal unfaltering and ardor fired. Now for the body care I nevermore, and all my consciousness is passion-free, keen with unfettered zeal, detached, calm and serene, I taste nirvana's peace. It is this peace that is featured in what is called the Psalms of the Sisters. And Caroline Rhys Davies put together all of the Psalms of the early Buddhist women. And they were called the Psalms of the Sisters. The sisters were called Theri, Theri. And the men were called Theras. And she combined with the Psalms of the Sisters, the Psalms of the Brethren, and they were finally published in the Polytext Society translation series as one volume in 1994. It's the first time they were put together. The early volumes were separate. Psalms of the Sisters and Psalms of the Brethren were called Psalms of the Elders. It's interesting to see, as we begin to understand, that when the genders are not seen in symmetry, are not seen in the not just the unity, but in the fertility of resonance, which then includes all kinds of variations of gender. It in fact includes all kinds of inconceivably lucid realization that there are genders beyond number in the cosmos. That there are worlds beyond counting in the cosmos. And that the proliferation of boundednesses is indefinite, but not infinite. However many, however large that number, it is in fact a number. It is only the spaces in between that are infinite, because it is the field in which they occur. And that field in which they occur can be fertile. And that fertile field, that zero field that is capable of spontaneously emerging number without end, is Mother Nature. And that infinite field of consciousness is the fertilizer of Mother Nature, in keeping with the symmetry of the way Mother Nature is able to become fertile through Father consciousness. That begs the fact that women, the feminine, are really the wisdom. This is a great discovery. When one comes to understand that Sanskrit is a made-up Indo-European language, ancient though it is, it came into being with the putting together of the Rig Veda about 1500 BC. And the 10 parts of the Rig Veda constitute about 1,000 hymns, 1,065 hymns in 10 books, 10 sections. And out of these, it's the 6th section that is really the earliest of the Rig Veda. But the Rig Veda is a confirmation of the fact that there are invaders that have come into India from beyond. They, in fact, have come into India through a great pass called the Khyber Pass. And if one went the other way on the Khyber Pass from northwest India, now Pakistan, one would come through the Khyber Pass and out about a day and a half's journey, one would come to Kabul, which is today Afghanistan. And it was there in ancient, before it was Kabul, before it was Afghanistan, that the ancient Avestan language from Central Asia was brought together in a collection of sacred songs, of hymns, of prayers by the ancient classical Zarathustra in his Gathas. So that in Avestan, Gatha in Sanskrit becomes Gita. In the Avestan, mantra in Sanskrit becomes mantra. And so on, that the Sanskrit language of those people coming from an Avestan language, Central Asian origin, come into an India no earlier than about 1600 BC. And when they came into India, originally, 100 years before collected together Sanskrit in the Rig Veda, that Indian civilization was already millennia old. That the native persons in that area of northwest India, that civilization originally was called the Indus River civilization, or just the Indus civilization. Later on, when archaeology began to proliferate, and its great advance was in the 1920s. The great archaeologist who founded all of that was Sir John Marshall. And there are 3 volumes of this classic, Mohenjo-Daro and the Indus Civilization. As it went on, we realized archaeologically that the original city was Harappa. And so Harappan civilization took over from the Indus civilization. And here's the first volume of Harappan Studies by the great author of the Harappan civilization, Gregory Possehl. It is important to understand, as Sir John Marshall wrote in the preface to his great 3-volume, The Indus Civilization, hitherto it has commonly been supposed that the pre-Aryan peoples of India were on an altogether lower plane of civilization than their Aryan conquerors, that to the latter they were much what the Helots were to the Spartans, or the Slavs to their Byzantine overlords, a race so servile and degraded that they were commonly known as dasas, or slaves. The picture of them gleaned from the hymns of the Rig Veda was that of black-skinned, flat-nosed barbarians, as different from the fair Aryans in physical aspect as they were in speech and religion, though at the same time it was evident that they must have been rich in cattle, good fighters, possessed of many forts in which they defended themselves against the invaders. These forts, however, were explained by Vedic scholars as being no more than occasional places of refuge. They were refuge because the original civilization, the India civilization, the Harappan, the Indus civilization, had no warrior class. There were no kshatras. They had no sophisticated armor. They did not have the sword. Their great cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, and many lesser cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were cities of hundreds of thousands of people, 1,000 years before the Aryans came into India through the Khyber Pass. And in order for those Aryan invaders, and the invaders were spearheaded, as usually it is, just like in the Ukraine today, spearheaded by the military. We have the swords, and we have the training, and you are fodder. The Harappan Indus civilization built a great stupa at the mouth of the Khyber Pass, and it was dedicated to Sphota, which is the mysterious silence out of which sound spontaneously first emerges. That the conch shells of the warriors can only be heard in the silence that is real. One of the great pauses in world civilization is in the Mahabrata, the great India war that was fought not in the Indus civilization, but further to the east. Fought outside of the river tributary confines of the Indus civilization, along the banks of another river system, the Ganges and the Jumna. Along the northern part of the Jumna is where Kurukshetra is, that is the field of the battle in the Mahabrata, in which the centerpiece of it at its very beginning is the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita has all the conch shells being blown, and all of the elephants trumpeting, and all of the Bronze Age warriors with their shields and swords, and this great melee of two great army. And in the center of that, Arjuna's chariot, with Krishna as the charioteer, drives in, and in the split-second pause, the entire Bhagavad Gita dialogue takes place. Let's take a little break. Let's come back from our break, from our pause. Books are coming out now that are incredible in their insightfulness and going unread. Going not only unread, but unknown. And part of Parayana is to bring these orphans back home and to have a population. A book that came out just a year or so ago called The Horse, the Wheel, and Language by David Anthony. How Bronze Age writers from the Eurasian steppes shaped the modern world. It was in fact, for a while, a book club selection for the History Book Club. The horse was tamed in Central Asia, and the tandem of horses to pull a two-wheeled wagon with an axle that went between the horses, the chariot, was born there. And so that whole civilization of Central Asia, the working center pivot of it, can be said to be Samarkand. Samarkand is on a great river, the Amu Darya River, and it snakes back to its origins in the high mountains of the Hindu Kush. And one can go along the Amu Darya. In fact, they did, in an ancient caravan trading route, originally by camels, that went along the Amu Darya and eventually was able to cross not the Hindu Kush, but to cross another pass that dropped down into what really we call colloquially the Gobi Desert. And to then etch along the foothills of a great mountain range, the Kunlun, the Dragon mountain range as it arcs around, and following this caravan road, one eventually came to a place where two great rivers had a confluence down below in the plain along that caravan route, and there was founded a great early trading center. Its ancient name was Khotan, Khotan. The Chinese have since shortened it to Hotan, Ho being river. It's the river place where they come together. And one of those rivers came from a geologic deposition that yielded black jade, the dark spinach green jade. It's called black jade. And the other river came from a kindred but different geological setting, and it also had jade, but it had very light colored jade called white jade. So that Khotan, ancient Khotan, is where the black and white jade came together with the horses and the chariots, and I named that caravan route some 20 years ago the Jade Road, and it went further along the foothills of the curving Kunlun Mountains, skirting the ancient Gobi Desert, which was not as fierce at that time because the desiccation was not that far advanced as it became. In fact, there were eventually branch cities made out into what today is the Gobi Desert from that caravan route, that Central Asian civilization who eventually were able, about 2000 BC, to refine their language because they needed to have a written language. Their trade routes were going so far afield, and not only far afield along the Amu Darya into the Gobi area and along the Kunlun mountains, but the other way, they followed ancient Celtic ancestors. At that time, the followers of the ancient Celts were called Scythians, and Scythian jewelry and gold and so forth are a part of that civilization that then were put together in Central Asia around Samarkand. Their ancient Celtic ancestors eventually had gone far to the west alongside of various river systems and had taken themselves all the way to Ireland. So that by about 4000 BC, there were Celts in Ireland who were highly civilized. And 2,000 years later, there were civilized Scythian, and they were grouped in such a way that the horse caravans extended themselves all the way into China, what became China, and they are the ones who brought all of the flowers and fruits and jade, and chariots and horses, and the Chinese were able to absorb those and found dynastic China. So that the first dynasty in China is called the Xia, have all of that inheritance of the Central Asian caravan route. The interesting thing is that when that civilization was put together about 2000 BC into a written language, the language is called Avestan. And the Avestan became refined about 400 years before anyone would have realized that the southern caravan route, which mirrored the northern caravan route in its great thrust to the east, also had a great poetess at its center, Enneduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, whose eventual linking of the original Sumerian sites with the original Eastern Mediterranean sites being connected by the Euphrates River system curving around and became a fertile crescent civilization. But so great was the genius of Sargon and his daughter Enneduanna, who made the language. At that time, the written language was in cuneiform, and it was an ability to bring together the farthest reaches from, as we talked last week, Ras Shamra, from the peninsula of Fennel. One could look out across the eastern Mediterranean Sea, the tip of Cyprus reaching out like a pointer of land. And from Cyprus to the Indus, the Sargon resonance of his trading routes went. And so the early Dravidian, as so-called, 1,000 years before there were Aryans in India, in that part of India, they understood that about 2300 BC, that there were trading routes that were open now, so that the Harappan civilization became, the Indus civilization became, the Mohenjo-Daro civilization became, great exporters of grain. They were fantastic at this. And in Sir John Marshall's excavations of Mohenjo-Daro, he found that one of the largest buildings archaeologically in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, because it was allowed by the invaders to go into ruin, and into ruin it did. One of the largest buildings there was a granary. And this granary was enormous, much larger than even a very large population would need at the time, because they were doing fantastic exports of grain and of attendant foodstuffs. And so they became, all of a sudden, increasingly bloated in the sense that they made cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa that were too large for the geography, for the history, for the topography that anyone knew about at the time. And so they literally leached themselves away from the natural base that could support their civilization, and it began to crumble. It began to fade. And it's exactly at that time that the sword-bearing, chariot-bearing, horse-plumed warriors came in through the Khyber Pass and considered these degenerate, dark-skinned, flat-nosed barbarians. And increasingly, as the Rig Veda came into play, it was the Aryan Vedic gods that now took over the way in which an Indra, with his lightning bolt-like, warlike capacities, the Greek equivalent of it, from the same peoples coming through the Scythians, coming into Greece brought Zeus. And so you have, at the same time, in Greece, one of the divine personages who is not at all a part of the Olympian god 12, 6 female goddesses and 6 male gods, not a part of that 12-form Olympian godhead, but nevertheless the most powerful of all of the gods was Dionysus. Dionysus, who then could take the grain that had made the bread and further understand that the fermentation can also make the wine. You not only can have bread, but you can have wine. And so Dionysius is the further refinement of that fermentation to make the wine, the god of wine, where everything of nature that Mother Nature has made is now capable of being wine, inebriation, something new. And in the India civilization, outside of the Rig Veda gods, is an energy, divinity called Shiva. And it is Shiva with his Shakti that is like Dionysus and his Maenads. The Maenads are the women who leave the city, who leave the town, leave their husbands, leave their families, leave that masculine hierarchical social order to go and be there in the openness, not the wilderness, but in the openness of nature again. And so Dionysus and Shiva are related together. And next week there's a beautiful study done of Dionysus and Shiva about 35, 40 years ago. Almost nobody mentions it. Nobody seems to have read it. Nobody seems to have understood. This is a major insight. But Shiva does not have his energy without his Shakti. It is the Shakti, it is the feminine, and it is the great goddess of Shakti who is the archetypal mother. This study published in Pune in 1987. Pune is in the western part of India, below Bombay. Shubhanga Atre, and she subentitles The Archetypal Mother, a systematic approach to Harappan religion. She is the understandable, ancient great goddess that in the Indus civilization was the lady of the animals. Later on, the way in which it was skewed is that the caste system, to marginalize and minimalize this great goddess, who then was called Kali, that she is the lady of beasts. Men and women who fall into her worship become bestial beasts. In this way, the skews begin to come into play. And in the Rig Veda, the first of 4 Vedas, the other 3 Vedas are rearrangements of the Rig Veda with some additions. One of the first was Atharva Veda, and Atharvan was supposed to be the son of Shiva, not really so. It is this quality that begins to illuminate that there is a great east, west, north, south parallel going on here. Two great caravan routes developing eventually almost at the same time written languages. The far west of Sargon's realm, by about 2000 BC, developed an alphabetical written language about the same time that the great Central Asian civilization developed written Avestan. That the original written languages, cuneiform in one, and early qualities of being a phonetic revision of the pictographic, logographic languages that they came across. The Harappan civilization had largely, originally, a logographic or a pictographic civilization writing, which only recently has been translated more or less by focusing on the imagery become the cores of the writing, and it's only later on that the sound, the phonetics, come into play and modify that. Just as in Chinese, one has pictographic languages originally, and by the time dynastic China refines itself about 1500 BC again, from the first dynasty Xia, kind of a phantom dynasty, into the Shang. And with the Shang, one has Shang bronzes. One has not just the early jade and chariots and horses and new plants and new fruits and so on and so forth, but one now has a domestic Chinese power civilization, a masculine hierarchy power civilization. The Shang are not only famous for the bronze ceremonial implements that suddenly show a great forceful power and social structure, but it has the ability to have Bronze Age dynastic reach. Just as you find wherever the Bronze Age comes into play, it is the glitter of the bronze sword, the bronze helmet, the bronze shields, that are able to literally penetrate and decimate copper-based instruments, copper-based uses, and it is all due to a very rare element. It's due to tin. By being able to smelt the original copper with a small percentage of tin, and occasionally a very smidgen of arsenic brought into play, one can make a very sharp-edged, serviceable bronze. And the Bronze Age came in this way and disappeared this way as well. Because what replaced the Bronze Age was the Age of Iron. Because an iron arrow will go right through a bronze shield and kill the user. A bronze sword will be able to be mangled by an iron sword. And so the Iron Age replaces the Bronze Age, which replaced a kind of a Silver Age, which also then replaced an early Gold Age. And now you have the 4 ages with the 4 metals that is current all the way to the Roman Empire, written down by Ovid in the Metamorphoses about 8 AD. 8 AD. When the Metamorphoses was published in Rome in 8 AD, making Ovid clearly the only competitor to Virgil as the epic poet of the Roman Empire. Exactly at that time, at 8 AD, a 17-year-old Mary Magdalene left Tyre, and her brother, who owned the shipping company for that eastern part of the Mediterranean, took her personally on one of their trading ships. The trading company was ancient Semitic trading company, set up in times of Sargon, of Akkad. Not only to go to Cyprus, but to eventually go to Rhodes, to Crete, to many other places in the Aegean, and also to Egypt and so forth. And the 17-year-old Mary Magdalene was brought by her brother Lazarus to Alexandria to reunite with the 17-year-old Jesus in Alexandria. All of these are nexus that form the sets of resonance that come into play as sets upon sets of resonance that make a very grand instrument. When you have all of the notes that make up the resonance of an octave, and then you collect the octaves together, 11 of them in this case, now you have a piano. Now you are able to make a new kind of music. This kind of an instrument is where we are now in putting together for the first time civilization with a capital C. This is, as one of my jazz friends used to say, this is Gabriel's high C, where Gabriel's horn hits the high C. That's the high Dharma note. It's like the note that Joshua proverbially sounded before the walls of Jericho, and those walls came tumbling down. Because when you hit the high C, what is already crumbling, what is already decayed, because it has run out of time energy. And when you're out of time, you're out of energy. You're out of gas, you're out of fuel. You can have a whole fleet of Panzer tanks, and when they're out of gas, it's so much rust. That's where we are now, 2014. In Egypt in 1500 BC came Hatshepsit, the first and only real powerful female pharaoh. This is the title page of a great book on Hatshepsit, my copy that I redid the title page. Came out in 1996. Joyce Tyndsley, the female pharaoh. She was pharaoh 1473 to 1458 BC. This is her remains that was confirmed and discovered. Science Daily had an article on it. It dates from Halloween of 2007. That's when it was confirmed that this forgotten mummy inside that decaying ancient swaddling for 3,500 years was Hatshepsit. And her great obelisk, these are handout pages for those who are following in a way in which it's sharing. This is her obelisk at Karnak, which is still standing. This was her great friend, and his name was Senumut, and Senumut was a great male companion to her in the sense of being able to translate her vision and her understanding into activity, like the practical arm of things. And he was also her lover and was the father of their daughter. And this is the daughter being held by the father. And this is a great, they only show a little bit, but there's a great block, like a cube, full of hieroglyphs on all four sides. This is his head and her head. This was the Pharaoh's mitochondrial daughter who had that mitochondrial DNA and could have passed it on. There is much more to understand, much more to appreciate. The key came about 200 BC in Alexandria, when a great swath of all of this came plunging together for the first time and almost bouncing off each other. And about 200 BC, it's usually dated by the great R.H. Charles's 196 BC. The great vision of Enoch was written down and published, and augmented then by 3 other parts to it, so it became a 4-part, not a frame of reference so much, but a square of attention. Because the original vision of Enoch was that fallen angels, those beings that live in heaven, who have come down to earth, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives, took them, had children by them. And those children were smarter, stronger than men and became giants. Giants in the sense that they took over the liveliness of power, because the fallen angels, there were about 200 of them, the vision of Enoch has. And those 4 books of the book of Enoch are all found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but what is not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were the terminus of their final burial, was 31 BC. The 5th book of Enoch is not a part of that. It is the quintessence of how all 4 of that coming together is transformed by a 5th, a visionary, quintessential 5th that goes into the space, the entire space of the frame, and exudes without any bounds, so it's that the frame floats in an openness field. And it's that 5th book of Enoch that is so important that when the book of Enoch in the Hermeneia series, the great biblical commentary of the late 20th, early 21st century, published in 2001, did not include the 5th book, the 2nd vision of Enoch, because it had not been written at the time that the other 4 volumes came out. The 5th book of Enoch was written in 3 AD. It was written by Joseph, who was the father of Jesus, when he realized that his son, at age 12, was ready for his proverbial year of study to prepare for his bar mitzvah. And so Joseph wrote what became the 2nd vision of Enoch, which has 3 parables, so that the parables of Jesus are due to the cues of his father for his bar mitzvah study, because he was being sent back to Alexandria by the shipping company of Lazarus, whose father had contracted leprosy, and so Lazarus had to take over the business. Not only take over the business, he had to take over his younger sister, Mary, in Tyre, where the business was. The older sister, Martha, was put in charge of a new house in Bethany, next to the leper colony in the cemetery region of the far reaches of the Mount of Olives, the other side. And there, the 12-year-old Mary Magdalene, their original home was in Magdala on the Sea of Galilee, met the 12-year-old Jesus on his way to Alexandria to do his studying for his maturation. Only it wasn't a 1-year maturation. He extended his study for another almost 12 years and didn't become the head of the therapeutic community until he was 23. And by that time, after 6 years with him, Mary Magdalene also was becoming 23. Had known each other since they were 12, had that spontaneous, infinite field, fertile zero field opening. So the Parayana has many aspects to it that are being woven not into just a fabric, but into a way of realization. The great Enoch seminars held on a world-class level, one of the first was Enoch and Qumran Origins, and one of the last was Enoch and the Messiah, Son of Man, revisiting the book of parables. More next week.